Professor Nam-Yong Lee's commentary, long, comparing the US and Korean business environments. If our conglomerates leave, Korea's future collapses. If you only watch the image of conglomerates running away by moving their headquarters wholesale, you will miss the real problem. What is happening now is the relocation of the entire growth axis, production facilities, capital investment, supply chains, and even critical mineral processing toward North America. The fact that Korea's outward foreign direct investment in 2024 was about $63.95 billion, and that investment into the United States was about $22.08 billion, the largest share, shows how serious this trend has become. The essence of the problem is not a lack of patriotism among conglomerates. When the US and Korea are compared, the direction in which capital moves is determined not by emotion, but by the rules of the business environment. The United States is not merely a country that provides a market, it is a country that exports the rules of the business environment. Korea, by contrast, is increasingly seen as a country whose business rules are too complex and too difficult to predict. The wider this gap becomes, the more Korea's factories, people, and technological learning will accumulate in a large-scale exit toward the United States and elsewhere. Therefore, the target of public anger must shift from conglomerates to the politicians and government bureaucrats who make the rules of the business environment. The stakeholder groups in this problem must be identified, authority and responsibility must be made explicit, and the relationships among them must be traced to the end to determine how they push firms to leave. In that process, it is the beginning of national normalization for Korea to reveal, through scientific statistics, where ignorance, incompetence and responsibility avoidance are occurring, and to demand accountability. No wonder the phrase conglomerates escaping the country has become fashionable these days. What is escaping is not a simple assembly plant. In semiconductors, when production facilities move, the entire ecosystem follows: equipment, materials, components, packaging, testing, workforce development, and research collaboration. Batteries and electric vehicles are the same. What moves is not a single factory building, but the supplier chain, standards, and certification systems together. If the United States begins to pull in even critical mineral processing and smelting, the bottlenecks of the supply chain themselves are reorganized around North America. In the end, Korean industry becomes hollowed out. Our youth, workers, and self-employed citizens will have no place to stand. The opening of Hyundai Motors' Georgia Meta plant in March 2025 and the repeated public announcements of large-scale US investment plans are not symbolism, they are a declaration of strategy. Samsung Electronics' investment in Texas is not merely factory construction, but a process of being integrated into the United States' advanced chip ecosystem, and the US government's confirmation of direct funding through semiconductor support programs demonstrates that intent. The crisis felt by Korean youth and workers is not just about the number of jobs. When high-value processes, engineering capabilities, and on-site data are accumulated overseas, the top rungs of Korea's industrial ladder are emptied. In the end, a structure is created in which even diligent work at home leads to no dreams and no hope, and the public's anger is not a moral emotion, but a structural distress signal. The first conclusion of comparing the US and Korean business environments is the power of rules. The United States is not a country that merely scatters subsidies. It is a country that changes the decision map of firms by bundling incentives, trade barriers, and local procurement requirements. Electric vehicle tax benefits are not simple consumer support, but a device that relocates supply chains through North American final assembly and requirements for battery components and critical minerals. These requirements are strengthened step by year, structurally disadvantaging the model of producing in Korea and exporting after production. Semiconductors follow the same structure. The United States places advanced manufacturing on the same line as national security and designs the system so that production, research, and packaging operate together on US soil. As a result, for firms, choosing the United States becomes not patriotism but a survival path. When the market is large and the rules are clear, capital flows there. This is a basic property of capitalism. By contrast, dissatisfaction accumulates in Korea because rules change frequently, judgments differ across ministries, agencies and local governments, and predictability is weak in licensing, electricity and sites. Firms dislike uncertainty more than they dislike costs. The greater the uncertainty, the more investment decisions tilt not toward domestic sites but toward overseas ones. The difference in taxes, finance and subsidies is not the size of money, but the difference in certainty. The United States has a federal corporate tax rate of 21% with state corporate taxes added, but the key is that it provides long-term packages of tax credits, subsidies, and loan support for specific industries. Korea has a top corporate tax bracket of 24% with a separate local income tax layered on top, and tax policy is often shaken by repeated reform debates and weakened policy credibility. More important than a 1 percentage point difference in tax rates is how stable policies and institutions remain when a company plans 5- and 10-year horizons. The US approach is an all-out approach mobilizing even state governments, factory sites, infrastructure, training, tax benefits, and regulatory support move as one bundle. A company does not have to wander among multiple ministries with a single investment plan. It reaches a conclusion quickly through a single window. As this experience accumulates, the United States becomes imprinted in the minds of investment executives as a fast country. Korea, conversely, often has the central government, the National Assembly, local governments, and public enterprises moving with different objective functions. Even if the Ministry of Industry wants to attract investment, the power grid can be blocked. Even if local governments want to attract it, licensing can be blocked. Companies postpone decisions and eventually go abroad. In that moment, responsibility disperses and results disappear. Electricity and licensing are decisive variables that determine the life or death of manufacturing. One of the coldest numbers in comparing the US and Korean business environments is the industrial electricity price. The comparison that, as of late 2024, Korea's industrial electricity price was about 190.4 won per kilowatt hour, higher than the United States' roughly 121.5 won, shows that the foundation of manufacturing cost itself is being shaken. Power-intensive industries have thin profits per unit, so differences in electricity prices immediately change the investment map. The more serious problem is not only the price level, but the consistency of policy. If power policy swings with political schedules and it is unclear who will bear costs, companies add a risk premium. That premium appears as reduced domestic investment. Without designing grid expansion, the generation mix, and long-term contracts for power supply to industrial complexes as one coherent package, advanced manufacturing will be difficult to keep at home. Licensing has the same structure. In the United States, the proposition that time is money is embedded in institutions, and state governments treat factory attraction as a survival strategy. In Korea, protecting the environment and safety is of course necessary, but procedures must be predictable and speed must be guaranteed. Regulation without speed becomes not protection, but a mechanism of exit. The problems of labor and youth are not wages, but the industrial ladder. Union bargaining power comes not from slogans, but from irreplaceable production bases. When production bases are dispersed, the foundation of bargaining power weakens, and wage and working condition negotiations become more unfavorable. In the end, what labor must protect is not short-term wages, but the design of conditions that keep future volumes, future processes, and future investment inside Korea. Opposition for the sake of opposition cannot protect factories. For youth, the issue is even more direct. Korea's R&D input as a share of GDP is among the world's highest, and the number itself is powerful. In 2023, domestic R&D spending was in the range of 119 trillion won and about 4.96% of GDP. The problem is that the pathway linking this massive R&D to mass production and high-quality jobs at home is being cut. If R&D outcomes are not accumulated together with domestic processes, the career ladder for youth is built overseas. Companies must move beyond the outdated separation of R&D at home, production abroad. They must present long-term contracts that keep next-generation processes, pilot lines, and the accumulation of process data in Korea, including local regions, universities, and suppliers. The state must not demand only effort from youth, but must create a structure in which the results of effort accumulate as careers inside Korea. The map of responsibility has already been drawn, and now a way to demand accountability is necessary. The President has the responsibility to command the priorities and speed of industrial policy as the final leader of national operations. The National Assembly has the responsibility to design taxes, regulations, and labor law, which determine the business environment in a predictable way. Local government heads have the responsibility not merely to attract one factory, but to operate an industrial ecosystem by bundling education, housing, transportation, and licensing. Government bureaucracies and regulators have the responsibility to keep law and principle while designing procedures together with industrial competitiveness. Public enterprises have the responsibility to operate tariffs, investment, and quality, not by politics, but by the principles of cost and supply stability. Yet reality easily flows into a structure in which authority is held while responsibility is divided. The costs of policy failure are shifted onto citizens, youth, and workers, while decision-makers move on to the next position. If this structure continues, companies leave, and only moral anger remains. Moral anger cannot substitute for governance, and governance can be established only through design, execution, and responsibility. Therefore, ignorance, incompetence, and greed must not end as personal blame. The institutions, procedures, and decision systems that institutionalize that ignorance and repeated that incompetence must be exposed. After exposure, responsibility must be demanded. A country that does not demand responsibility repeats the same failure. Citizens must demand responsibility through presidential, parliamentary, and local elections. The prescription is not slogans, but a redesign of relationships. First, the national investment decision system must be integrated. It must specify what to keep at home by industry, which processes to treat as core, and which supply chain bottlenecks to solve domestically. Second, licensing, electricity, and sites must be bundled into a single timetable and presented as predictable commitments. Third, a supply chain dashboard must be operated to show bottlenecks in real time by integrating industrial workforce data, electricity demand data, and logistics data. Fourth, workforce matching, R&D consortia, and regulatory special provisions that companies can use immediately when investing domestically must be standardized. Fifth, a manufacturing infrastructure package bundling the power grid, industrial complexes, water supply, ports, and cybersecurity must be made into a national product. Labour must elevate future investment and technological transition as bargaining agendas. Companies must present in contract form the conditions for keeping high-quality jobs in Korea. Youth must be guaranteed fair opportunities and career pathways with mobility. Politicians and bureaucratic groups must be evaluated not by words, but by numbers, schedules, and performance indicators. Finally, the procedures of accountability must be institutionalized. If audits and evaluations of industrial policy failure end as one-off events, nothing changes. Goals, schedules, budgets, and regulatory reform performance must be disclosed, and a structure is needed that clearly assigns responsibility for failure by position and institution. Only then can citizens stand not as objects of enlightenment but as subjects of judgment. The conclusion is simple but heavy. Put plainly, if Korea's leading conglomerates move to the United States, Korea has no future. If we stop at resenting the companies that leave, the solution disappears. We must trace, through a relationship network of authority and responsibility, who created the unbearable business environment that made them leave. At the core of that network lie the operating systems of the President, the National Assembly, local government heads, bureaucratic groups, and public enterprises. Driving citizens, youth, and workers into a valley of war and death is not only the work of external enemies. When internal ignorance, incompetence, and responsibility avoidance accumulate, the nation's future industries quietly slip away. The numbers are already warning us. What is needed now is not rage, but design. After design comes execution, and after execution comes responsibility. Wise citizens must express that will. Thank you for watching Professor Nam-Yong Lee's commentary, Long.